Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Okay, well, this podcast is going to be about the recent outbursts by Kanye West. For those who haven't been paying attention, the rapper Kanye West has seemingly pulled out the greatest anti-Semitic hits of the past couple hundred years, both through a series of tweets and also on a variety of podcasts. And this has really caused hundreds of people to reach out to me personally, asking me my opinion and asking to talk about it. I address this in the class I teach at UCI. I discuss this with high schoolers at Temple Beth Tikva. I've gotten dozens upon dozens of social media questions about what's happening. And it really seems that the root is an overall confusion about two things that we're going to get into on this podcast. One, the confusion is about anti-Semitism as a construct. A lot of people don't truly understand what anti-Semitism is, where it comes from, how anti-Semitism might be different than other forms of bigotry such as racism or Islamophobia. And the other then comes in this unique American moment of, even for the people who do say, I understand anti-Semitism, why is anti-Semitism so bad? Why does it seem like every society, really for the past couple of thousands of years, has fallen prey to some sort of anti-Semitic ideas and notions, conspiracy theories about the Jews? So those are the two questions that we hope to address today. Before we get into the podcast, this episode is sponsored by Magen David Adom. When there's an emergency in Israel, be it a car crash or rocket attack, everybody dials 101. The voice at the other end answers, Magen David Adom. Virtually everybody in Israel knows somebody whose life has been saved by Magen David Adom. Well, Magen David Adom is inviting you to join us in a heartfelt, meaningful, and musical tribute to this life-saving organization on Monday, November 14th at Temple Bat Yam in Newport Beach. A concert featuring Mada EMT and world-renowned cantor and singer Shai Abramson and Mada Senior Paramedic Aryeh Myers. Please contact Alana Mitchell at emichael@afmda.org for more information. Again, this event will be taking place on Monday, November 14th at Temple Bat Yam. So I really want to start this podcast by getting something off my chest. I really don't like talking about anti-Semitism. Now, this might sound like a stupid or obvious statement. I don't think anybody as a part of any community that's been historically marginalized or hurt enjoys talking about that. But for me, it actually goes deeper. See, it's not just that talking about anti-Semitism is not the most exciting or fun topic, but I actually think that the ethics of Jewish community leaders talking about anti-Semitism actually needs to be approached with some nuance. Now, here's what I mean, and I want to frame this through a historic debate that happened in the American Jewish academic community in the beginning of the 20th century. A Jewish historian named Salah Baron, who was the first American Jewish historian to serve as a chair in any major university in a Jewish studies department, wrote a lot about what he deemed the lachrymose conception of Jewish history. Now, what did Salah Baron mean by this lachrymose conception of Jewish history? Well, Professor Baron writes, that previously much Jewish scholarship, especially Jewish scholarship that talks about the Jewish community in the ancient world, the Jewish community in the medieval world, even the Jewish community in the postmodern, post-Enlightenment world, oftentimes talks about the Jewish community as the sad basket case of victims that have been bounced around from one country to another. In one country, they might find a pogrom. In another country, they might have faced an expulsion. Another country, maybe they're considered dhimmis, maybe second-class citizens. And there's one way to read Jewish history where it really does seem like this is true. Now, on a factual level, I don't deny any of this. I'm obviously no stranger to the vast array of victims and terrible tragedies that have befallen the Jewish community as a direct result of anti-Semitism over the past couple of thousand years. My hesitation to talk about anti-Semitism does not, and I repeat, does not stem from a denying of any of the facts in terms of the history or any of the pain, sorrow, and tragedy that the Jewish community has faced from all of these horrid attacks throughout our history. Rather, what Salone was worried about, And what I am becoming increasingly weary about is everything, to some extent, is a trade-off. Let's say, as a case study, I have 1 hour a week to talk to a group of high schoolers, a group of college students, even a group of community members about Judaism. This is a real economics of education question. What percent of the time do you spend talking about anti-Semitism? What percent of time do you spend talking about positive elements of Judaism? What percent do you talk about the history of Judaism? Again, everything is a trade-off. Everything in education, especially in community leadership, has an opportunity cost to it. And what Salah Baron was realizing is if Jewish historian and Jewish thinker after Jewish thinker was talking about the Jewish community as the sad basket case of victims that sort of were kicked around from one place to another throughout our history, that does two things. One, on a historical level, it doesn't make us masters of our own destiny. When we think about Jewish history, when you have the bird's eye view of the past 2,000 years of Jewish history in your head, who's the chief architect? Is the chief architect Jews being at the whim of the political powers that be? Is this Jews being at the whim of various hegemonic governments, be it the Christian governments or Islamic governments or other governments? Is a story that we tell ourselves, that we tell our children, that we tell our grandchildren about Jewish history, one where we are subject to the whims of outside forces and we've been acted upon? Or do we have a view of history where we are the principal architects? Yeah, sure, there have been those outside forces that have attempted to attack, that have attempted to destroy, that have attempted to wipe out the Jewish community. But it's actually us. It's been the community itself that's been able to forge their own path. It was Jewish thinkers, in other words, were after the terrible expulsion from Spain, moved to the north of Israel, to Tzfat, to come up with a new way of understanding history, God, and the world, known as the proliferation of the Kabbalistic movement with the Arizal, right? That's just one such example. When we frame Jewish history in terms of anti-Semitism, in terms of tragedy, we run very high risk of people's conception of Jewish history being that we are just a force that's acted upon as opposed to a force that acts itself. In terms of the present, this actually has the same set of pathologies. I don't want people's identity of Judaism to be rooted in something negative. I don't want Jews, be they young Jews, be they older Jews, to fall prey to thinking of Judaism in terms of their victimhood. And this is a real risk. It's a real risk that actually requires a lot of nuance to balance. And even going out on a limb and talking about this, it's funny, just to sort of peel back the curtain on this podcast, I reached out to a lot of people in the Jewish community, a lot of friends of mine who I knew are experts about anti-Semitism. And I told them exactly what I wanted to talk about. I told them that I wanted to talk about anti-Semitism, both from a present and historical point of view, but also in terms of the wider ethics of how much do we talk about anti-Semitism. And almost everybody in some way said, I don't know if I feel comfortable talking about that, right? This seems to be getting into controversial waters. And it might be a little bit. And I am sort of going off the cuff here. I didn't prepare paragraphs upon paragraphs of what to talk about. But I wanted to sort of peel back the curtain as somebody who has dedicated my life to building Jewish community, to Jewish education, to ensuring that Jews, both young and old, have a deep connection to our rich history, to our rich literature, to our rich culture. What do I think are the potential pitfalls of an American Judaism that becomes so obsessed with all of the ways in which we are attacked that we can't forge a path forward? Yet on the other side of the coin, again, because every Jewish question has a good argument on the other side, there are times when anti-Semitism is so front and center in the Jewish community, in Jewish history, where it would practically amount to some sort of rabbinic or Jewish educator malpractice to avoid discussing it. And that's where I find myself today. Again, anti-Semitism is never front and center in my mind. If somebody tested me and told me to give 100 classes about Judaism, maybe I'd have one class on anti-Semitism only because it was a very real part of Jewish history. But I'm not going to frame Jewish identity in terms of the people that hate us. That would be tantamount to letting the anti-Semites win. But again, when anti-Semitism is so ubiquitous, when I have dozens of teenagers telling me that all over TikTok there are people defending Kanye West and his conspiracy theories about Jews, when I have older community members telling me that they're reading YouTube comment after YouTube comment about people saying, I don't see why what Kanye's saying is so bad, there obviously needs to be discussion about it, right? And this is true both, of course, for people in the Jewish community, but it's even more true for people outside of the Jewish community. Are non-Jews going to show up and become allies to the Jewish community in the same way that they would for other historically oppressed minority groups? And seems like it's a real question in American society. Okay, well, with that introduction off of my chest, and I'm excited to hear any and all comments about said introduction, both if you agree and if you disagree with me. Again, as I said in the first introductory podcast, I think 17 podcasts ago, I view this podcast much more as a communal conversation. And so it's specifically when people disagree with me that the conversation can happen. Think about how short and how boring the Talmud would be if every time Hillel gave an opinion, Shammai kept their mouths shut. And that really is how I view my role as an educator. Again, people who are too afraid to go into the public sphere and express ideas and opinions are not actually interested in furthering the conversation in the American Jewish community. Jewish history, Jewish literature, great Jewish thinkers have never moved the Jewish community forward by trying to play it safe, be it on a philosophical, theological, or sociological level. Okay. Anti-Semitism is confusing. And what do I mean by anti-Semitism is confusing? Anti-Semitism is really hard to define. It's pretty easy to some extent to define racism. It's pretty easy to define sexism. It's pretty easy to define Islamophobia. It's only seemingly when it comes to anti-Semitism that even today in the Jewish world, the common refrain that if we ask 2 Jews, we're going to get 3 opinions about the definition of anti-Semitism, it seems like that is something that is fodder for wider debates across the Jewish community. And we see it today. Again, the number of different definitions of what anti-Semitism is, both internally within the Jewish community and a more global academic point of view in terms of anti-Semitism, is quite astonishing. So why is this? Well, it's always been my theory, it seems seemingly obvious to some extent, that the reason why anti-Semitism is very hard to drill down and define is actually because Judaism and Jewish identity is hard to define. What do I mean by that? Well, the most common question when it comes to Jews and Judaism is, what are we? Are Jews a religion? Are Jews an ethnicity? Are Jews a culture? Are Jews a nation/nationality? Are Jews a race? Are Jews some sort of mixture between all of these different things? Right? The answer is obviously some sort of mixture, right? Obviously, we have ethnic elements, we have religious elements, we have cultural, we have nationalistic elements, right? It's very hard to define a Jew as any one thing. And so it's seemingly obvious that then it's going to be hard to define anti-Semitism as any one thing. To take the most obvious example in pop culture, and again, I do know this is getting far away from Kanye West, there's a massive debate in the Jewish community right now about, is anti-Zionism always anti-Semitism? Is it never anti-Semitism? Is it sometimes anti-Semitism? And this wider debate about is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism hinges on a much more fundamental premise. Is Jewish nationalism, aka Zionism, is that a part of Jewish identity? Is a part of Jewish identity the fact that we have a nation state that we subsequently have the right to self-autonomy in? If you believe that Judaism is just a religion, as let's say the 1885 Reform Movement's Pittsburgh platform did, Jews are just a religion, then unsurprisingly you're going to say, okay, great, we do not believe in Zionism. If you believe in or observe that Judaism is not just a religion, but actually has a nationalistic component, then you're much more likely to be a Zionist, right? Of course, a nation has a right to its own nation state, right? And we can sort of go down this rabbit hole forever, and just a asterisk and footnote here, the Reform Movement has moved on since the Pittsburgh platform, so just to throw that out there so I don't get a bunch of people upset at me. So I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes going through the history of anti-Semitism. Because again, I think this could be a helpful resource, both for people in the Jewish community that might not be completely aware about the different developments of anti-Semitism, and certainly as a resource for those outside of the Jewish community that are just plain confused. And I see this all the time. The number of times I have non-Jewish students, non-Jewish people approaching me, asking me questions about anti-Semitism and Jews, a lot of times they almost don't know how to ask, right? If you imagine the 4 children at the Passover Seder, right? You have the wise, wicked, and simple son, and then you have the one that is so dumbfounded by what's going on, they don't even know the right words to formulate a question. That's where most of American society is about anti-Semitism. They see everything going on. They see the proliferation of these ideas about Jews, and they're like the son she'eno yodea lishol, right? They just have no idea how to formulate the words of what's going on. And so, just like in the Passover Seder, right, you have to allow them to start the conversation, right? You have to basically put it into easy bite-sized pieces. And that's what I attempt to do in the next couple of minutes. The vast majority of scholars, historians, academics, pinpoint the ancient Greek world as the beginning, the birthplace of what they call anti-Judaism. For simplicity's sake, I'll say anti-Semitism. For those who are into academic nuances, there is some nuance there, but for the purpose of this podcast, I'm just going to say anti-Semitism. So what was Greek anti-Semitism? Well, we have some ancient writings from various Greek sociologists, right? There's one interesting one that I actually use as a reading for my class, a man named Hectatius of Abdera from the 3rd century BCE, where he notes that the Jews have often been treated badly by various kings, by various governors that are around the land, yet even though Jews are being hurt by various governors and mayors, they cannot be dissuaded from acting what they think best. I'm directly quoting from Hectatius here. And he continues, but when they are stripped on this account and they have torments inflicted upon them, and even as they are brought to the most terrible death, they will not renounce the customs of their forefathers. So Hectatius is giving an observation here. And he's saying that in the ancient world, Jews were not treated well, right? Anybody who's read early accounts of the Talmud and Jews under Roman control, right, will sort of see what he's talking about in terms of the Greco-Roman wider cultural world. And here Hectatius is seemingly saying, if you had to reduce Greek anti-Semitism to something, I would consider it a type of cultural anti-Semitism. What do I mean by that? Well, even think of the story of Hanukkah as a framework here. What's the story of Hanukkah? The story of Hanukkah is a dominant Greek empire, right after Alexander the Great comes and takes over the ancient Middle East in the year 333 BCE. Slowly but surely, the Greek Empire, the Greek culture attempts to Hellenize the wider ancient Middle East, right? That obviously included Israel and Jerusalem. This, of course, comes to a boiling point about 100 years later, in about 167 BCE. Again, we're counting down because we're in the BCEs. And finally, the story of Hanukkah is when a ragtag group of rebels known as the Maccabees finally decide enough is enough, right? Greek hegemony is pressing too hard. They're trying to press dominant Greek ideology and culture too much onto the Jewish community. We've had enough. But if we just consider the sociological background to the story, in the ancient world, Jews had their own customs, right? Think of this in terms of Jewish dietary laws, Jewish prayer laws, Jewish laws of what we wear, right? It doesn't seem crazy to understand that in the ancient Greek world, especially as things were evolving quickly, if you had this one group of people who were set on maintaining the cultures of their ancestors, the mitzvot, the halachot, right? These ideas that have stretched in Judaism for hundreds of years before the Greeks ever entered onto the global scene. This is what a lot of historians pinpoint as the beginning of the Jews being labeled as a sort of communal other, right? Sure, the Jews had been persecuted before, right? For those who know their Jewish history, right? We had Egypt, we had Assyria, we had Babylonia, we had Persia. But what a lot of scholars note about these early empires is they actually treated a lot of groups terribly, right? The Jews weren't somehow unique in the Assyrian and Babylonian eyes. We were just one of dozens, if not hundreds, of smaller minority groups that demanded retribution or being attacked or becoming a vassal of the wider empire, right? We won't get into all the nitty-gritties of history there, right? It's not until the Greeks take over ancient Israel where now we start to see in writing after writing and sources after sources of people pinpointing the Jews as this type of other who's so content on fulfilling the customs of their ancestors that no matter what happens to them, they're going to maintain this connection, right? This, of course, over the next couple of hundred years, right, becomes more and more ingrained in the Greco-Roman world. I alluded to this before, but if one wants to sort of read a first-hand account from the Jewish community's point of view on this, there are a lot of stories in the early Talmud and the Midrash about all of the various ways in which Jews, especially rabbis, were persecuted by the Roman Empire, right? Famously, on Yom Kippur, we have a custom, and also on Tisha B'Av, of reading about the 10 martyrs, right? Rabbis such as Rabbi Akiva, who were tortured and put to death by the Roman Empire for just wanting to be Jewish. At about the 2nd to 4th century CE, so again, now we're a couple hundred years after Alexander the Great takes over, the nature of anti-Semitism begins to radically shift. And again, this is important because in our wider conversation about what anti-Semitism is, it is really important to understand the unique types, inflection points, evolutions of anti-Semitism to understand how, in the year 2022, in our world today, there are so many different types of anti-Semites and so many different ways to be anti-Semitic, right? So let's read this through the historic narrative. What happened in the 2nd to 4th century CE in the world? Well, of course, the rise of Christianity, right? It started with the early church fathers, subsequently becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire. And one of the things that a number of Christian writers had to deal with, unsurprisingly, was the Jewish rejection of Jesus Christ as the Messiah. Now, why was this particularly difficult for early Christian thinkers? Well, I'm going to try to reduce a lot of complex history into about 2 minutes here, but from a very basic level, much of Christian literature is based upon early Jewish literature, right? The Old Testament is, of course, the Tanakh with a different name and a slightly different ordering in the book. Moreover, the way that the New Testament and the way that early church fathers such as Augustine read the Tanakh / Old Testament is as typological predictions for Jesus. And so if you ask your average Christian how they read certain stories in the Tanakh, such as Abraham sacrificing Isaac, Jonah and the whale, many of the prophets that talk about end times, right, such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, Yechezkel, they are going to read these all as typological stories predicting the rise of Jesus Christ. Therefore, one can imagine from some point of view, again, not defending the view, just trying to explain it, why, if these things that were so obvious to early Christian thinkers, and it was sitting right there in the holy books of the Jewish people, namely the Tanakh, well then how could the one community that's been the most interested in what these texts have to say not see the obvious writing on the wall? And so this starts a whole genre of early Christian literature condemning the Jews not for any specific cultural practice, but specifically on behalf of religion. Just to read a couple of quotes here. Now I'm reading from the book of Acts, right? One of the books in the New Testament. He says to the Jews, "You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit. As your fathers did, so did you. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one, whom you have now betrayed and murdered. You who received the law as delivered by angels and did not keep it." Right? And so you can see in some of these early New Testament books, right, some of these apostles trying to deal with, again, this very real sociological tension that was happening in the ancient world. Again, not to defend anything here, but just to understand from a historical perspective why anti-Semitism ended up getting so bad. If the Jews are the people in the world that understand these texts the best, and they're not listening to them, well, they must be these terrible people who betray God, right? The Jews are refusing to listen to their own holy books. Therefore, the Jews are the people who reject God. Therefore, understandably, you can see how this then develops into this metaphor of the Jews condemning and not listening God eventually evolves into a very realistic notion that the Jews are the ones who killed God, aka Jesus Christ, right? This comes out more in Augustine, right? He was a 4th century CE Christian thinker, where he says at one point, Judaism since Christ has been a corruption. Indeed, Judas is the image of the Jewish people. Their understanding of Scripture is carnal. They bear the guilt for the death of the Savior, for through their fathers they have killed Christ. And Augustine then writes in another place, the very presence of Jewish people in the world puts a great question against Christian belief in a new covenant made through Christ. There's a wider discussion to be had here about whether or not Christianity is rooted in anti-Semitism, whether it's inherently anti-Semitic. I don't want to go there. Actually, if people are interested in this, I think 3 or 4 podcasts ago, I interviewed a rabbi named Michael Harvey about his book specifically on this issue. It's called A Rabbi Speaks to Christians. And it's exactly on this issue of writing a sort of open book, open letter to the Christian community of how to basically pinpoint which elements of Christian tradition are rooted in anti-Semitism and how one can be a modern Christian without getting caught up in the inevitable anti-Semitism that's sort of woven into ancient Christian writings. I don't want to go there too deep in terms of this, but just to point out that this second iteration of anti-Semitism, where Jews were already pinpointed as a separate minority group, right? Jews were already considered some sort of other in society. They were already considered a minority. And all of a sudden, when church gets the power of the Roman Empire, this image of the Jews as this small minority that happens to have some weird and eclectic practices that's deserving of condemnation evolves and inflects into a full-on, I don't want to use the word conspiracy yet, but I think the word conspiracy is actually warranted, conspiratorial view of the Jews, that because the Jews have rejected what Christians believe to be the obvious reading of earlier scripture, that Jews are now deserving of punishment for rejecting God, and not only rejecting God, but killing God. Now, once Jews become pinpointed as the people who killed God, right, as Christ killers, certainly the most nefarious anti-Semitic idea in history, right, and even from a historical perspective, because it's interesting. Scholars debate, right, just to sort of peel back the curtains, right, without going down this academic rabbit hole, scholars on the historicity of Jesus are torn, right? Personally, right, I've read arguments for whether or not Jesus was a historic person, whether or not Jesus wasn't. In my opinion, it makes sense to think that he was a historic person, right? There don't see any good reasons to deny that. But we know almost nothing of Jesus' life from a first-hand account, right? Even the early Gospels, right? Mark, Matthew, Luke, all of those, right? They're writing after Jesus had already died, right? So we have zero first-hand accounts of Jesus during his life. So the question of who killed Jesus, right? Was it a Jew that turned him over to the Roman Empire, right? From some sort of historic perspective, they might be interesting, but I actually want to suggest it doesn't matter. Let's say it was a Jew that killed Jesus, or let's say it was a Jew that turned Jesus over to the Roman Empire. That was one Jew, right? Again, bigotry and racism comes specifically when you hold an entire community accountable for the actions of one person. So it doesn't make a difference what the religious or ethnic background of a person who did something wrong in history was, right? That does not mean that entire group should be reduced or condemned to the same view that you view that one person, right? This is sort of step one of obvious views of the world, right? And this is something that, again, the early Christian community, and again, it is a little deeper than I'm able to explain here, but the early Christian community ended up holding all Jews accountable for this singular act that, again, maybe happened or didn't happen, and continuously interpreted this for levels of metaphor after levels of metaphor, where if the Jews are the type of people to kill God, Well, that means that the Jews have no moral bearings. That means that there's nothing that they won't do. So what's an example? Well, in the medieval ages, let's say in England, if a young boy goes missing and they believe that he was killed, who did it? Well, it must be the Jews, right? Why did the Jews do it? Well, the Jews are so immoral, so demonic, that perhaps the Jews have to kill young Christian boys in order for them to practice their rituals, right? This, of course, turned into the blood libel, right? This specific anti-Semitic conspiracy, right, the idea of a blood libel starting in Norwich, I believe in the 13th century, I don't have the dates in front of me now, right, personally led to the murder and expulsion of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Jews, right? There were other ones, right? If a plague proliferates throughout European cities, well, it must be because the Jews are out there poisoning the wells of the Jewish cities, right? And anti-Semitic conspiracy after anti-Semitic conspiracy continuously goes, again, pinpointing on the Jews as a religious group are so nefarious and evil that they need to be killed, forcibly converted, or expelled. Now, the idea that the Jews need to be forcibly converted is an interesting one, because one of the fundaments of Christian anti-Semitism is that the Jews are bad, right? I'm going to use a very vague term, right? The Jews are deserving of persecution because of their religious identity, right? So now we fast forward into the Enlightenment, right? And the Emancipation, right? The late 1700s, early 1800s in Europe. And if we know one thing about the Enlightenment, right? We think back to our history class in high school. It's the power of the church in Europe was on the down, right? The power of the church was waning, and the power of nation states and government and 18th, 19th, and 20th century rationality was on the upside. And with this came a sort of de facto equality of religion. And what do I mean by that? Well, in countries such as France and then eventually England and Germany, in the late 1700s and early 1800s, Jews, by their religious origin, are started to be seen as normal people. Hey, listen, they're just like us, right, on a religious level. But again, so much of what we know about historic oppression and systemic oppression is you can't wipe away a legacy and systems that have been rooted in oppression with a simple snap of the finger and a law. So yes, the church began to lose its power, but it's not like these anti-Semitic conspiracies just dissipated, but they morphed. And so we get to now the third inflection point of anti-Semitism, where I'll call post-Enlightenment anti-Semitism. It wasn't focused on the cultural elements of Jews like the ancient Greeks. It wasn't focused on the religious elements of Jews, what do Jews believe and why, like Christians did. Post-Enlightenment anti-Semitism can perhaps be best defined as attacking Jews as a people / ethnicity, eventually developing into attacking Jews as a race. What do I mean by this? Well, all of a sudden now, in Europe, people began talking about, as opposed to framing the world in terms of religious groups, this is when the study of ethnic groups, the study of race, even to some extent the study of nationality and nationalism began to be on the rise. And so the Jews, again, still this other, still this minority group, still this group that people had every sort of single ingrained psychological bias just on the pretense that they were the other. This slowly developed into a view that Jews as a people, as an ethnicity, as a race, are somehow nefarious for a variety of reasons. Right? Probably the most famous conveyor of these ideas came in the late 1800s book, The Protocols of Elders of Zion, where this conspiracy theory suggested that Jews were somehow behind major world changes, such as the banks and the media and all of these things, and really Jews were attempting to achieve world domination, right? This is much of actually what Kanye West has been talking about, right? Kanye West, it seems like, has been opening up the Protocols of Elders of Zion and quickly skimming the paragraphs every time he's about to open his mouth and go onto a podcast, right? But this is how anti-Semitism, again, changes and evolves from it being based in religion to being based in something essentialized or fundamental about Jews. And now this had a number of differences. in terms of Christian anti-Semitism. While, yes, this is obviously rooted in the legacy of Christian anti-Semitism, it started to morph. What's the most obvious way? Well, again, if you're a Jew in the Middle Ages, you were able to convert to Christianity. You would have avoided at least the majority of anti-Semitism. Now, I say that a little bit with a asterisk because, of course, even after Jews converted a lot of times in Christian-controlled medieval Europe, there was still some skepticism about whether or not they actually converted. So, born Jews who subsequently converted to Christianity were still not generally treated as equal Christian citizens in Europe. But again, this at least eradicated the majority of the hate, certainly the expulsions and the torture and the libels against them. All of a sudden now, in this post-Enlightenment, in this 1800s, in this 1900s view of Jews, the Jew is essentially nefarious, according to these views, right? Nothing a Jew can do, right? And this is certainly according to Protocols of Elders of Zion, this, I don't even know if I should call it a philosophy, this evil philosophy was subsequently developed in the Nuremberg Laws and Hitler by saying that there's actually something racial about the Jews that is essentialized. And when I say essentialized, what I mean is there is nothing a Jewish person can do to get rid of whatever stain the anti-Semites think Jews have, right? So unlike Greek and unlike Christian anti-Semitism, where if a Jew were to assimilate into the Greek Empire and become Hellenized, or if a Jew would convert to Christianity, they were fine. Now in Europe in the 1800s and 1900s, there was nothing a Jew can do to get out of being condemned and hated. Now this is where, again, some of the trickiness about definitions of anti-Semitism come into play, right? And at this point, I have a basic question. If you were trying to connect anti-Semitism to other forms of hate, is anti-Semitism closer to Islamophobia, or is anti-Semitism closer to racism? What's the difference? Well, from some perspective, Islamophobia is attacking a religion to some extent, right? Technically, if you are born Muslim, if you're born in any specific religion, you can convert out of it and then you cease to be Muslim. Now, of course, this gets muddied a little bit, right? Of course, there's still going to be some sort of racism against Middle Easterners, regardless of religion. But if we think about racism, racism is somehow much more essentialized in terms of the nature, right? There's nothing that a race can do to avoid being hated by the racist, right? Because race is an essentialized feature in the view of somebody who's racist. Again, not in my view, right? Should be an obvious caveat here. So again, Jews become both, right? Jews become hated for their religious views and what they believe or supposedly believe, and Jews become hated for some essentialized feature of their race being nefarious. So they can't win, right? If you're a Jew, what do you do to stop being hated? Do you say, well, I'm just going to convert to Christianity? No, because you're still racially a Jew, right? You would not be safe in Europe in the 20th century if you did that, right? You can't switch races. You can't do anything. And so Jews sort of get quite literally caught between these competing definitions, which have lasted until today, right? Are Jews today hated, let's say in American society, or let's say in the wider world? Are Jews the target of so much hate because of things that we believe or things we do? Or are Jews the target of so much hate because there's something essentialized about the Jew that is the product of hatred? Or have these two ideas, even though they're almost opposite ideas, become so ingrained in our society and people's way of thinking about Jews, they've actually become muddied together, and your average person you ask on the street, if you ask them to define Judaism or to define anti-Semitism, they would actually have no idea because, again, because of this complex history. This then gets us to the last two comments I want to make. And again, I'm going to end this by saying anybody who wants to talk more about this, please, my email, as I give a lot of episodes, is dlevine21@gmail.com. And again, I am more than happy to discuss this as much as anybody here would like. Couple last comments. Contemporarily in America, Jews are caught between two competing strong political ideologies, neither of which is friendly to Jews or Judaism, right? On the far right, we have the same historic white supremacist, neo-Nazi-like thinking where race is what matters in a society, and the Jews are certainly not white or pure in terms of their racial makeup, right? Anybody who's read any white supremacist or neo-Nazi or Nazi literature knows premise one of this type of thinking is that Jews are racially impure and nefarious. Oftentimes, Jews are at the lowest of the caste system in terms of racial purity, whatever that means, right? Again, if you ask a far right-winger, white supremacist person what they think about Jews, they would say Jews are a tainted race, right? And that is why they are deserving of, again, contempt, hatred, torture, expulsion, if you're trying to create an all-white America, there. On the far left, right? The far left, which to some extent, right, and we can talk about the legacy of Marxism and the legacy of anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. But on the left, Jews are actually treated the exact opposite as they are on the far right. On the left, Jews are treated almost oftentimes as the epitome of whiteness. Jews, in this sort of wider cultural view of who the Jews are considered the people who are sitting behind society, almost to some extent controlling it, but not because of their race, but because of their culture to some extent. So from a leftist point of view, Jews are not only white, but they actually have greater privilege than average white people. So again, think about this. You have one group on the right saying Jews are not white, they are lesser than. And on the left, you have people saying Jews are the epitome of whiteness, they are privileged, and for sure they're not deserving of any of the special treatment that other minorities get. You can even think about this in the context of the state of Israel, right? Without getting into wider debates about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, think about it this way. For much of Jewish history in Europe, people would look at Jews, and especially if you were interested in some racial purity of your country, this is something that actually Amos Oz writes about. He says that when he was a child walking the streets of Europe, he would see poster after poster saying, Jews, you are not European, go back to your homeland in Palestine. And he says, well, now that we did it, now that we founded the state of Israel, now when I go to Europe to talk, I see posters saying, Jews, get back to Europe, you have no right to be in Palestine. So again, we can't win, right? To some extent, Jews are Schrodinger's people, right? When it hurts us to be white, we are white. When it hurts us to be non-white, we are non-white. When it hurts us to be a religion, we're a religion. When it hurts us to be an ethnicity, we're an ethnicity. When it hurts us to be a nationality deserving of a nation state, we are a nationality deserving of a nation state. That said, if you find yourself reducing Judaism to any one of these groups, whether you're inside the Jewish community or without, pause for a second and think about, are you giving an authentic definition of Judaism or anti-Semitism from inside the Jewish community, or is this sort of what you've always been told about the Jewish community? Okay, two other last comments before we conclude. If you're listening to this podcast and you want to learn more, right, let's start from a Jewish angle, right? So if you're part of the Jewish community, again, really the only practical advice I can give, because every time I talk to people, they ask, well, what should I do? You're not going to cure anti-Semitism. I know that sounds a little bit blunt, but the more you read about history, the more you read about the ubiquity of anti-Semitism in our culture, no amount of responding to people on Instagram and TikTok comments or responding to friends you might have gone to middle school with that are now tweeting support of Kanye West is going to cure anti-Semitism. So what should you do? Yes, anti-Semitism is a problem. We need to talk about it. But don't forget the positive aspect about Judaism. Learn about your own culture. Do Jewish things. Connect with Jewish community. Right? Be a part of the strong community that anti-Semites throughout history have been so afraid of. Right? Just by you being a proud Jew and learning about the richness of your own culture, you are winning the battle there. Right? If you're a Jewish educator, don't fall into the trap of just talking over and over again about anti-Semitism. Yes, it's a low-hanging fruit in terms of what gets people. I remember one of my rabbis, I won't give their name, because again, I know that this gets muddled in controversy and people don't always want to be connected to this conversation, said, you know what? If I were to give a Shabbat drash where I called the problem of anti-Semitism and how to fix it, the synagogue, the shul would be full of people, and people would sign up, and you can attract hundreds of people into the shul. But if I wanted to give a speech about the weekly parsha and about what different Rishonim, medieval commentators, and different midrashim, ancient rabbinic commentaries said about it, you get about 20 people that are listening, right? This is a problem, right? So if you're a Jewish educator, again, focus on the positive aspects of Judaism. We cannot have it so that we're raising the next generation to think of their Jewish identity primarily in terms of how many people hate them, who hates them, why people hate them, and all of the reasons why they should be afraid because people hate them. Yes, of course, this is an important part of Jewish experience and Jewish history, but it cannot become the totality of what it means to be a Jew and what it means to practice Judaism. Finally, if you're not Jewish and you're listening to this podcast, what should you do? Go to Jewish functions. Go and ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Again, I always talk with, groups of students, both Jewish groups and groups of non-Jewish students, and I always say, don't be afraid to ask any and all questions you have about Judaism, right? Anybody showing up to a Jewish event, be it a synagogue, be it Hillel, be it a Jewish studies class, is obviously there because some part of them is interested in learning more about Jews, Judaism, Jewish culture, Jewish religion, all of those things. Don't be afraid if you word questions a little bit wrong. Don't be afraid that you might say something that seemingly sounds offensive because you've used the wrong language. I'll speak personally because, no Jew in history has ever been able to speak on behalf of the Jewish community, though many have tried. Don't be afraid if you're talking to me of any microaggressions, right? There are too many macroaggressions in terms of how people have related to Jews throughout history for me to worry about microaggressions. If you use the wrong term in asking a genuine and heartfelt question about Judaism, very few Jews will take any offense to that. More likely, they'll be very happy you asked the question and say, oh my God, I'm so happy you actually want to learn about Judaism, Jewish community, Jewish culture from a Jewish experience, because I always joke to students, if you have a question about Judaism, I would much rather you have a conversation and hear the answer from me than look up on YouTube videos and Reddit forums about said answer, right? So again, anti-Semitism is complex, it's multifaceted, it is important to talk about, and also that does come with a tough tension and nuance of how often and how much do we talk about it. And again, I don't pretend like this is the final word on this conversation. I'm open to having my mind changed. I hope whoever listening to this is open to having your mind changed. And let's make this a real conversation. Because again, in a world where Jewish educators, Jewish community have limited resources, limited economic funds, limited time where students and community members are showing up to Jewish functions, we have to ask ourselves a real question of what is the balance of positive to negativity that we're trying to bestow.